So you want to learn how to make amazing palettes. Well, in this video, I'll teach you exactly how to do that. Starting with the one thing you don't want to do, making your palette or your build incredibly bland. So we're going to start off by making this wall out of spruce wood planks, stripped spruce logs, and a little cobblestone for the base. Now, do these materials make sense? Yes, they do. But they all end up blending together in a way that just doesn't give much color, or it doesn't give anything that would stand out. They're all dark blocks, and the framing and the wall kind of blend together, which honestly gets rid of pretty much all the depth that was added, making the frame and the wall. So you can see there's a bit of a problem there. You don't really want to make it so that everything blends together perfectly. You want the palette to divide parts of the building. It gives you more to look at, and it just feels a lot more interesting just because there's more stuff to look at. Well, now that we've discussed the problem with doing things like that, it's time to discuss a conclusion. Something to help make it more interesting to look at. Instead of using blocks that would just make sense for that build, you want to think of blocks that would not only make sense, but also separate certain parts of the building. Instead of using cobblestone as the base, we could use a mixture of andesite and just normal stone, which looks a lot more bright, which would separate it from the dark framework we have. However, adding cobblestone to that would make it look a bit more interesting. So it's not like you can't do that. In fact, mixing usually works better with 3 blocks. Now, even though we do have a good palette here, one that kind of brings diversity and looks fairly interesting, there's no reason we can't make it better. You see, we're still just using wood and stone. They might be different shades, but they're still, again, just wood and stone. So by adding a separate color, this being green, it adds a lot more feeling and, again, contrast to the brown and gray building that we had before. However, who says that our wall has to be made of wood? In fact, most medieval builds aren't actually using wood as their main wall. They use some other separate material. And they use that material because it has color and is contrasting the base, the frame, and even the roof. So what we're going to do here is we're going to separate the base, which is going to be made out of the stone blocks, and the top, which we're going to switch to a white block, this block being wool. Now you can see this palette would work incredibly well for medieval builds. A green roof, cobblestone base, and a white wall, which I'm not really sure what that would be made of, but it's made of something, that's for sure. Now you can see the difference between these two is pretty massive. While the left one still looks like a good house with the completely brown with cobblestone base, that was probably used a lot back then. But even though the right one was still probably used less, it gives it more personality and just looks a lot more interesting overall. However, speaking of themes and styles, there's a little something with palettes that you should probably know about these. You see, the shape looks like a rustic house. The palette is a rustic themed style. These two things almost always need to fit together. And if you want a little bit of proof for that, we're going to go on to a rustic shaped house with a modern palette. You see, modern builds usually have more square and just right angles. This just doesn't work. The shape is clearly rustic. This is a rustic or medieval shape, but since the palette is made of blocks that just wouldn't really work like this, or wouldn't really exist or be used back in the time that these houses were made, it just doesn't feel right. Now, the right one doesn't technically look terrible. It still has a charm. The palette is good, the shape is good, but they don't fit together properly, which is why it doesn't look amazing. Overall, both good houses. But the left one, the rustic themed house, just works better in every way. And now we're going to move on to textures. Okay, so remove all the colors of a block. Remove everything you can see about it. Just make it all black and white. What do you see? You see the texture of a block. That's it. Some of them are completely smooth, like concrete. Some of them are a little rougher, like wool. But no matter what, these can be incredibly important. If you can find the perfect colored block, but the texture just doesn't work at all, go with one similar to the color, but with good texture. Because even if the person can see the color really well, the texture is something that would just annoy them terribly if it were wrong. A really, really, really good example of this would be glazed terracotta. Every once in a while, it'll have a really good color, the perfect one you need, but it is incredibly hard to find a good way to use it in a building. However, that doesn't mean it's impossible. I've seen it used by many professionals, though not very often. Now we're going to move on to something that, while texture is a massive part of it, is basically completely separate. This is going to be a block's weight, or at least the weight that it looks like it should have. So the way this would affect building, or I guess the palette, is you don't want to have this stuff just randomly scattered around your build. Usually you'd want the heavy blocks being at the bottom of the wall, or on some kind of overhang or underhang or something like that. So I'm going to be using polished granite, and bricks to show this off, mostly just because I actually do enjoy using those three blocks. Obviously, polished granite is the heaviest, bricks is the second, and normal granite is the lightest. Usually the heavier blocks have like a grid-like pattern, while the lighter blocks just don't. However, you'll be able to tell just by looking at them, so it should be pretty easy. Now you can see here that using these things, I'm not just making one, like, 2 block layers and just go up. It's just completely flat. I'm actually trying to sort of mix it around. It gives it a much more gradual feel, which is something palettes really do help with, and is something that can honestly bring a build to life. Now, having the heavier blocks on the bottom kind of makes the wall feel more like a foundation. It gives it more sturdiness, which is why you shouldn't do what I'm about to do right now. That being, have the lighter blocks as the bottom and the heavier blocks on the top. It sort of makes it feel really unbalanced, which obviously is not really what you want. Instead, you would want it to feel more like, obviously, sturdy and more realistic, even though this is a game made purely out of squares. Now, obviously, it does still look alright. It could definitely be used, but it's more usable if it's sort of added as an upper part. The bottom, if that were to be used as the bottom, it just wouldn't look right. It's not terrible, but it's not great either. So if you are going to be doing it, make sure you have a good reason to. Otherwise, it just looks completely unnatural. And in case you were wondering, a good situation to do this is in some sort of like toppling building, something that just doesn't look very sturdy. So if you're going for something like that, then yeah, this actually could do really well. This could be an amazing way of doing it. But otherwise, again, no, don't do it. Don't do it. Anyways, though, we're going to be moving on to something that I'm not sure I've heard many people talk about. This is what I like to call fake depth, or color depth, texture depth, just palette depth, I guess would be a good way of explaining it. This is when you put 2 blocks that have extremely different textures, colors, and maybe weight right next to each other. The difference in all those things will make it look like it's almost on a separate layer. And considering layers is honestly a very key factor of building, definitely something I would recommend. And in fact, this is something that many professionals do, especially ones that don't actually use the extra layer of framing. Now, a really good framing block for this would be pretty much any kind of stripped log. Those often have a like very separate texture to honestly pretty much every other block in the game, which is why most people like BOO would use this. And if you're making a really small house in survival, I would suggest doing it too, at least for medieval and rustic houses. Now, this style of framing and building usually works better with more contrasting blocks, things like brown and white, which is what I'm using right now, maybe green and purple, pink, things like that, though I would suggest only using them if they do fit the theme of your build. Now, just because this trick is most commonly used with framing, especially from more well-known builders, doesn't mean that's all it should be used for. In fact, in a couple of seconds, I'm going to show you a use that is fairly more common, I guess. That being a connected foundation. For this specific foundation, I am using normal diorite and polished diorite, which its color matches the snow, which I'm using as the main wall, but its texture is different in a way that sort of makes it look like it's on a separate layer, like it's coming out, and it adds quite a lot of fake depth that it just looks so much more interesting. Plus, it even gives the perfect place to put a window. Now, obviously, you don't have to keep these blocks on the same layer if you're going to be doing this. Using multiple layers is always going to work. In fact, it usually works better, but using both of these, both physical layers and fake layers with texture and palette, it'll just make it look so much better. It'll disconnect it and separate it so much that the odds your eyes will not be able to see the line of separation is basically zero. Whereas with the first example, the first thing we did a while ago, it blended in so much that it just didn't feel quite as comfortable. And you can see the distance we've gone from just a like completely brown wall basically to something with so much more color and so much more interest. It looks just better in almost every possible way. Plus, with detailing, if you make the block color separate from that of the wall, it'll also look really good because it's able to separate that and the wall even more. Plus, if it's a separate color, then it'll just add so many colors you can see. The more amount of colors, the better it is. At least most of the time. Now, I would suggest not sticking with this, because as you can see here, physical depth is still very important. Something that, honestly, far outperforms the fake depth. So is it good? Yes. Is it the only thing you should use? Heck no. But you should definitely use it. So, what have I shown in this video so far? So the first thing I've shown is a difference between a completely bland wall to something with incredible contrast and color. The second thing I've shown is how important it is to keep your palette connected with your building style. Next, I've shown how important the texture and weight of a block are when building. Finally, I've shown you how you can use all of these techniques to trick your eyes into seeing depth that isn't actually there. And now we're going to move on to something a little more advanced, but still something everyone should use. Which would be me telling you that if you really do want to learn how to get really good at building, and specifically palettes, go check out Wintertooth's video about this. I will link that in the description, and hopefully a little card will come up too, if I'm feeling like it. And Quint's videos. He has a video that just came out, well, at least from the time of recording, about depth, palette, and all that. And on top of that, he's the member, or not the, but a member of the Windcraft content team, which means he's pretty much one of the highest level builders you can get. So if you want to know about palettes, go check out those two videos. Pretty much everything I know is from them or included in them, so see ya. I do hope I was able to teach you some stuff, and I hope you have a good day.